Learning about the conversion of the Apostle Paul led an educated and skeptical English statesman to become a Christian apologist. In 1747, George Lyttleton penned Observations on the Conversion and Apostleship of St. Paul. Lyttleton wrote, "I thought the conversion of the Apostleship of Paul alone, duly considered, was of itself a demonstration sufficient to prove Christianity to be a divine revelation." In this very short and influential work of 18th century Christian apologetics, Lyttleton examines the life of Paul, found in Acts and in his uncontested letters, and offers the following quadrilemma. Number 1, either Paul was an impostor who said what he knew to be false with an intent to deceive, or number 2, he was an enthusiast who imposed on himself by the force of an overheated imagination, or number 3, he was deceived by the fraud of others, or number 4, what he declared to be the cause of his conversion did all really happen, and therefore the Christian religion is a divine revelation. According to Lyttleton, the statements made by Paul in his epistles cannot be doubted without overturning all rules by which the authority and genuineness of any writings can be proved or confirmed. In the previous video, I looked at the "was Paul an impostor" question. You might want to go back and watch that video first. In this particular video, we'll examine the question of whether or not Paul was deceived. Did Paul experience some kind of religious hysteria and overinterpret what he saw? Well, the content of Paul's claims makes it unlikely that he was mistaken. But first, let's examine Paul's personality. Lyttleton says that Paul lacked the general ingredients of enthusiasm. He wrote that he wasn't given to great heats of temper, melancholy, ignorance, credulity, vanity, or self-conceit. Rather, Lyttleton says that only a quick and warm disposition is to be found in Paul. Paul became all things to all men. In the most trying moments of his life, he exhibited prudence and had regard to the decorums of society, as we can see when he's before Felix and Festus and Agrippa. Paul also doesn't seem to be depressed. Even though he said that he would like to depart and be with Christ, he was willing to cheerfully spend his life preaching the gospel. Even while he was writing in prison, Paul repeatedly spoke of joy and living without anxiety. In the book of Philippians, we see that. We also see no evidence that Paul felt any excessive guilt regarding his actions. Before he converted, he seemed more than content with his particular lifestyle. Paul certainly wasn't ignorant and credulous. He was extremely educated and very slow to believe the claims of the Christians. As someone who had lived in Jerusalem for a time, it's difficult to imagine that Paul was a stranger to the news of the miracles of Jesus. He had the facts of the resurrection and presumably would have heard the arguments against them. He had heard what had happened at Pentecost and of all the miracles worked by Peter and the other apostles up to the death of Stephen. Far from being easily duped, Paul had closed his mind to every proof and refused to believe. Lyttleton says that nothing less than the irresistible evidence of his own senses, clear from all possibility of doubt, could have overcome his unbelief. So was Paul full of self-conceit and suffered from some sort of messiah complex? Paul definitely doesn't seem like somebody who would have any delusions of grandeur, like some people who confuse their own foolishness with God's will. We see so-called prophets on Christian television who claim to take constant trips to heaven and feel compelled to share their latest revelations. Paul, on the other hand, saw himself as the least of all the apostles. He taught that having all the spiritual gifts in the world meant absolutely nothing without exhibiting divine love. Leaving Lyttleton's book for a moment, some recent critics have offered additional scenarios based on what we know from modern medicine, such as conversion disorder. Conversion disorder begins with some sort of stressor, or trauma, or psychological distress. As a rule, physical symptoms of this syndrome affect the senses and movement. Among the symptoms are temporary blindness and hallucinations. According to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders DSM-4, women are 200% more likely to experience conversion psychosis. Adolescents, military personnel in battle, people of low economic status, and those with low IQ are also more prone to experience this phenomenon. Paul doesn't really fit this bill. Furthermore, researchers have estimated the number of patients with ongoing symptoms of conversion disorder to be only 2 to 5 individuals per every 100,000 patients per year. Given the rarity of this condition, we would need some very strong evidence to demonstrate that this is really the case. Some have also speculated that Paul's visionary experience was the result of an epileptic seizure. The problem with this theory is that complex visual hallucinations related to epilepsy are incredibly rare in adults. Adults who are affected by these things typically experience them as children first. The age of onset for epilepsy is generally either in childhood or from the age of 60 onwards. Paul would have been outside of those age ranges. Furthermore, adults who hallucinate during seizures are in the minority. It's critical to differentiate between things like blindness, flashing lights, and foggy vision from things like hallucinating a talking person. Some medical literature calls both of these things hallucinations, but clearly the latter is much less common than the former. In other words, we're talking about a rare symptom of a rare disorder presenting at an anomalous age. In addition, the specificity of the Apostle Paul's vision doesn't match the typical hallucinations, which tend to be far more random. In the case of Paul, he saw the despised Jesus in glory, rebuking and commissioning him. Also, Paul's temporary blindness was also unlikely to be related to epilepsy. This is because ictal blindness blindness is most often observed in children and is very rare in adults unless they have symptomatic epilepsy where the cause is known. That is not accounted for in the biblical story and would not last for 3 days. Perhaps the strangest naturalistic hypothesis that's been made is that Paul saw a meteor on the road to Damascus. A meteor would explain the bright light in the sky that Paul said was brighter than the sun shining around me, and such a light full of intense ultraviolet radiation could temporarily blind someone, and a meteor could also send a shock wave and knock people to their feet, as with what happened to Paul and his companions. It would also explain why Paul's companions heard something but didn't understand what was being said. But how could this meteor produce a voice and carry on a conversation in Hebrew? And how could a meteoric light have given visions to Paul and Ananias simultaneously and in such a way that each was led to a course of action fitting in with that of the other? And how could the meteoric light have both struck Paul blind and given Ananias the power of immediately restoring his sight? There's also the fact that Paul's conversion and the miracle of Ananias were but parts in a long series of wonderful events. These included Paul working miracles from Jerusalem to Lyttleton. Skeptics are really reaching here. Moreover, severe bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, psychotic breaks, and so forth seem incompatible with a well-educated, intelligent person in a leadership position traveling throughout the Greco-Roman world planning churches. In today's world, people with all kinds of disabilities can achieve these things, but only with the help of modern medicine. It seems unlikely that Paul would have been able to accomplish all of this in his historical context. Some have tried to argue that Paul's thorn in the flesh was some kind of medical condition. However, given the context of his statement, it would appear likely that he was referring to persecution. Some kind of fit of madness doesn't really explain Paul's subsequent miracles. One 19th century apologist who was inspired by Lyttleton's argument wrote, his fellow travelers, Ananias at Damascus, Sergius Paulus, the prudent deputy at Paphos, Elymas the sorcerer, Eutychus at Troas, priests and people at Lystra, the jailer at Philippi, the barbarian Maltese, Erastus the city treasurer at Corinth, and Dionysius the learned Areopagite at Athens must have all been equally mad, and mad with marvelous uniformity, mad too with a madness which gave feet to the lame, eyes to the blind, healing to the sick, freedom to the iron-bound captives, and life to the dead. Given the content of Paul's testimony, any theory of him being deluded requires layer upon layer of improbability. The conversion of vicious persecutors into faithful martyrs is unfortunately quite rare. One cannot find similar conversions among numerous notorious murderers throughout history. Finally, there is the possibility that Paul was deceived by others. This third possible explanation, Lyttleton dismisses in less than a single page. The other apostles and early Christians couldn't have deceived Paul. The fearful Christians were wary of approaching him after receiving word of his conversion. It was also physically impossible for them to deceive him. How could they produce a light brighter than the noonday sun? And who might have caused him to hear a voice speaking out of that light? Could someone make him blind for 3 days and then return his sight with a word? And again, no fraud could have produced the miracles that Paul worked. Lyttleton concludes that unless we're willing to set aside the normal rules of evidence by which facts are determined, we should accept the whole story of Paul's conversion and life as historically true. Therefore, the Christian faith is proved to be a revelation from God. For someone to remain skeptical, one would need to argue that the extra details in Luke Acts were added later. This is where the importance of the accounts in Luke Acts and other Gospels come in. Are these physical details, the later miracles worked by Paul, and the appearances to the disciples, just later embellishments made up by Luke? As I've argued in these videos here, we have multiple lines of evidence for the honest, unembellished nature of the Gospels and Acts. So what do you think about Lyttleton's argument? In the comments down below, let me know what you think. Does his quadrilemma work, or is there another option that maybe he didn't think about?